Did John Stuart Mill have much chance to indulge in the pleasure principle as he grew up?
The pleasure principle was certainly not applied to Mill's young life in the same sense as Jeremy Bentham's. 1748 to 1832, formulation, although it possibly was in Mill's more nuanced version of utilitarianism, which distinguished between higher and lower pleasures. Mill's father, James, with help from his friend Bentham, educated the young Mill at home. Young John knew Greek at 3, Latin at 5, logic by 12, and economics by 16. He was also deeply schooled in a social mission to increase the good for the greatest number through progressive political programs. Mill had a nervous breakdown at 20. Biographers believe that his highly structured and rigorous childhood education was the cause of an emotional imbalance. The humanities had been neglected in his education, and his social interactions with peers were limited by the demands of his studies. Mill then began a course of study in literature to develop his more humanistic sensibilities. He read Romantic poetry and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and he began to rethink Bentham's simple hedonic calculus. The result was Mill's famous distinction between higher and lower pleasures and a scathing assessment of Bentham's character as oblivious and uncultured. Bentham, an essay first published in the London and Westminster Review in 1838, and revised in 1859 for his own Dissertations and Discussion, Volume 1.
In his case, it was, why should a human being not commit suicide?
The question arose for him from his apprehension of the human condition as absurd, together with the absence of God and a forever frustrated search for meaning. Camus was a friend of Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905-1980, but they became alienated from each other as a result of Camus' critique of communist tyranny in his essay In Favor of Revolutionary Struggle, The Rebel, 1951. His novel The Plague, 1947, dramatized the ever-presence of death in human life. In his non-fiction essay The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942, Camus claims that meaning can be found by affirming the absurd and then rebelling against it, as in Imagine Sisyphus Happy. Sisyphus' punishment by Zeus consists of eternally rolling a large boulder up a mountain, only to begin again after he has reached the top and the boulder has rolled down again. His crimes were first to put death in chains and then escape death himself. Camus was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957. His own death in a car crash raised the question of his suicide. Paul Ricoeur, 1913-2005, wrote on a variety of subjects, including existentialism, phenomenology, ethics, psychology, and theory of language. All of his work was distinguished by a deep engagement with key figures in the history of philosophy. His Freedom and Nature, 1950, was received as a rejection of Sartre's theory of freedom. Ricoeur argued that willing always has an involuntary component. which works as a kind of built-in resistance. What is voluntary consists of motive, decision, and consent, each of which has its own involuntary moment. The involuntary moments include birth, death, character already developed, the body, and the unconscious. First, it's not clear that Sartre equated freedom with acts of will. Because freedom is present in all consciousness. Second, Sartre would have said that what we accept or recognize as involuntary requires a free choice of bestowing that particular meaning.
Who was Michel Foucault?
Michel Foucault, 1926 to 1984, was an acclaimed French philosopher, who also had French licenses in psychology and psychopathology. His father and both grandfathers were medical doctors, and the ways in which he analyzed European culture, through an archaeology of concepts, probably owes as much to medical diagnostic methodology as it does to continental intellectual criticism. His principal works are his published dissertation, Madness and Unreason. A History of Madness in the Classical Age, 1961, The Birth of the Clinic, 1963. The Order of Things, 1966, The Archaeology of Knowledge, 1969, Discipline and Punish. The Origin of the Prison, 1975, and The Multi-Volume History of Sexuality, 1974. The Order of Things was a bestseller in France, leading to his worldwide fame. In that book, Foucault argued that sciences do not simply pop up as sources of truth on their own, but require prior ideas of human nature and truth in order to be supported and accepted as sciences.
What did Bertrand Russell think about his use of logic?
Russell believed that logic could be used to solve both philosophical problems and everyday ones. If propositions were translated into the correct logical form. To accomplish this, he held the ideal of a logically correct language. For a while he thought that his student Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889 to 1951, was on the right path toward supplying that. But Wittgenstein only alluded to such a language in his early work and abandoned the project later on.
Did Sigmund Freud analyze himself?
Yes, he did, and several examples show that he aimed for complete disclosure. On his own Oedipus complex, he wrote, "A friend, I have found, in my own case too. The phenomenon of being in love with my mother and jealous of my father, and I now consider it a universal event in early childhood. Even if not so early as in children who have been made hysterical." He was also just as willing to analyze literary characters and authorship. Thus, he famously wrote about Shakespeare's Hamlet. Fleetingly the thought passed through my head that the same thing might be at the bottom of Hamlet as well. I am not thinking of Shakespeare's conscious intention, but believe, rather, that a real event stimulated the poet to his representation, in that his unconscious understood the unconscious of his hero. Freud also collected his own memory lapses, slips of the tongue, and dreams for analysis. In the 1936 article A Disturbance of Memory on the Acropolis, he explained why he felt doubtful and uneasy when he visited the Acropolis in Greece in 1904, it must be that a sense of guilt was attached to the satisfaction in having gone such a long way. There was something about it that was wrong, that from earliest times had been forbidden. It was something to do with a child's criticism of his father, with the undervaluation which took the place of the overvaluation of earlier childhood. It seems as though the essence of success was to have got further than one's father, and as though to excel one's father was still something forbidden. Freud's father had been too poor to make such a trip, and not educated enough to have been interested in the Acropolis.
Did Karl Marx live in poverty himself?
Yes. After he was kicked out of Brussels and Paris for his revolutionary writing, Marx and his family found refuge in London. In 1850 they were ejected from their two-room flat in Chelsea for failing to pay the rent. They found cheaper accommodation in Soho, where they stayed for 6 years. In order to help Marx with an income, Friedrich Engels returned to work for his father in Germany. The two kept in constant contact, and over the next 20 years they wrote to each other about every other day. During this time, Marx sought to understand capitalism by reading back issues of The Economist, as well as journal articles, in the reading room of the British Museum. The Marx's fifth child, Franziska, was born at their Soho flat, but she only lived for a year. Eleanor was born in 1855, but later that year Edgar became the Marx's third child to die. The family owned very little, and some days Marx could not leave the house because Jenny had to pawn his trousers to buy food. But on some Sundays, they all went to Hampstead Heath for picnics. After Marx began earning money from his articles for the New York Daily Tribune, and Jenny's mother left her a small inheritance, they were able to move to Kentish Town. In 1856, Jenny had a baby that was stillborn, and after that she caught smallpox. Although she survived this illness, it left her deaf and badly scarred. Marx also grew ill, and he wrote to Engels that such a lousy life is not worth living. But when he had an outbreak of boils in 1863, he was consoled that it was a truly proletarian disease. Both the working class and the owning class have their own ideologies, which unreconstructed are the ideology of the owning class. That is, the owning class sees the world in a way that justifies their position. For example, in believing that all who have great wealth have earned it by hard work. The politically dominant class in a society is the class that economically controls the main means of production. In general, the ideology of any social class is the result of where that class is located in terms of the dominant means of production in its society. Workers and others need to realize that workers are human beings who become alienated from their own labor when it is merely treated as a commodity on which their employers make a profit. The short-term solution to this situation is for workers to unite and demand better pay and working conditions. The long-term solution is a historical process through which capitalism will destroy itself through its own internal contradictions. The erstwhile workers will then become socialist owners who are able to pursue self-fulfilling activities, instead of merely laboring to survive from one day to the next.
Was Diotima of Mantinea a real or fictional female philosopher?
Diotima of Mantinea, who is said to have instructed Socrates on love in Plato's Symposium, has been believed to be a fictional invention since the Renaissance. Before then, she was assumed to have been a real person.
How and why was Locke's idea of the social contract different from Hobbes'?
Locke held that the social contract was an agreement between citizens or their representatives and the government or king. Because basic amenities of human life and its fundamental social institutions were present before the social contract, government was not as essential in Locke's view, as it had been in Hobbes'. Human society existed and functioned well before government. And if government dissolved or if the governed brought it down for just reasons, society would still exist. However, if something destroyed society, that would also destroy the government.
Did Russell have a humorous side?
Although he suffered from depression on and off throughout his life, this did not suppress Russell's wit. As the following quotes show, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser people so full of doubts. I would never die for my beliefs because I might be wrong. It has been said that man is a rational animal. All my life I have been searching for evidence which could support this. Aristotle maintained that women have fewer teeth than men, although he was twice married. It never occurred to him to verify this statement by examining his wives' mouths.
Who was Marie-Louise Enkendorf?
She was the pseudonym of Gertrude Keinel, George Simmel's wife, under which she published her own philosophical writings. The Simmels maintained a salon for intellectuals but otherwise enjoyed a conservative, bourgeois family life. They had one son.
Did Malebranche have a more extensive philosophy to support his theory of causation?
Yes, Malebranche was highly regarded as a theological metaphysician. In his major book, The Search After Truth, 1674, he developed his theory of vision in God. Malebranche agreed with René Descartes, 1596–1650, that ideas in the mind are the basic units of perception and knowledge. But he argued that our ideas are actually in God, rather than in us. This vision in God was especially important for abstract knowledge, according to Malebranche. Because universals, mathematical truths, and moral understanding were part of the vision in God. As such, they reflected God's knowledge of what was eternally true about the world he had created. In his treatise on Nature and Grace, 1680, Malebranche provided an explanation of how God's goodness, omnipotence, and omniscience could allow evil in the world. He claimed that God could have created a more perfect world without the known evils of the present one. This more or mostly perfect world, however, would have been more complicated than the world God did create. And creating that world would have contradicted God's principle of acting in the simplest possible way, according to general laws. This simplicity and generality could also explain the unequal distribution of grace among human beings.
What did George Berkeley think of the distinction between primary and secondary qualities?
Seventeenth-century empirical philosophers believed that secondary qualities are what we perceive, namely colors, sounds, textures, and smells. They thought that primary qualities like mass and number were the qualities of atoms that made up objects. We can't perceive primary qualities, but the 17th-century empiricists held that it is the interaction between the primary qualities of atoms that cause our perception of secondary qualities. For example, the atoms in red paint interact with our eyes, through light, to cause the experience of red. But Berkeley denied that there was a distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Because it is impossible to have an idea of a primary quality such as mass, extension, size, or number without also having an idea of its color, texture, or other secondary qualities.
What did John Stuart Mill think about Jeremy Bentham's pleasure principle?
Jeremy Bentham, 1748–1832, had introduced the idea that the only thing good in itself was pleasure. By the time Mill wrote his Ethics, this was widely known as Bentham's pleasure principle. Mill recognized the value of pleasure, but was more interested in happiness.
What was Franz Brentano's psychological theory of right and wrong?
Brentano thought that judgments can be correct or incorrect and that the same held for loving and hating. If a thing is good, then it is impossible to love it incorrectly. Correctness in loving and hating is objective, as is incorrectness. Brentano was an intuitionist concerning such correctness. He thought that we could be immediately and directly aware of the fit between the emotion and the object. 1859 to 1938, the founder of phenomenology, and Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, the father of psychoanalysis. He was ordained as a Roman Catholic priest in 1864. But renounced his vows after engaging in a dispute about papal infallibility. He resigned his professorship at the University of Vienna, so that he could marry, and was not able to regain that position. Later years left him blind. But he continued to write in virtually every subfield of philosophy until he died. Brentano's principal writings are psychology from an empirical point of view. 1874, and Our Knowledge of the Origin of Right and Wrong, 1889.
Who were the main early modern philosophers?
The customary division is between the rationalists and the empiricists. René Descartes, 1596–1650, Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716, Benedict de Spinoza, 1632–1677, and Nicolas Malebranche, 1638–1715, are usually listed as the epistemological rationalists. Thomas Hobbes, 1588–1679, and John Locke, 1632–1704, as the empiricists. However, for a more complete picture, Francisco Suarez, 1548–1617, should be counted among the rationalists, and Hugo Grotius, 1583–1645, among the empiricists.
What did philosophers after Parmenides assert about the nature of appearance?
Before Plato, there were several attempts by philosophers to rescue the reality of changing, moving components of our ordinary experience from Parmenides. Claim that the only thing that is real is the one, which does not change. These philosophers who came after Parmenides tried to establish the reality of things that move or change. Or in other words, they wanted to reassert common sense against Parmenides. Mysterious claim that the world we think is real is not real, because it is not the one. Plato returned to Parmenides' ideas as a foundation for a more elaborate distinction between appearance and unperceived reality. Although for Plato the unperceived one was in fact many. Aristotle provided the most successful defense of common sense and of the Reality of appearance by insisting that the world of appearance was real.
Who was Jules Henri Poincaré?
Jules Henri Poincaré, 1854–1912, was a mathematician, physicist, and philosopher of science. He responded to the discovery of non-Euclidean geometry by suggesting a modification of Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804 claim that we have synthetic a priori knowledge of the world, that is, certainly true knowledge that applies to reality, which is not based on experience. His proposal was what became known as conventionalism, namely that physicists will retain Euclidean geometry because it has the simplest geometrical conventions and is therefore appropriate for them. This proposal was short-lived in mathematics, because Albert Einstein was to show in his general theory of relativity that the curvature of space obeyed the principles of non-Euclidean geometry. However, the broader principle of conventionalism, namely that truth in science depends on agreement about specified rules, was to be revived as an idea of scientific truth in the 20th century.
What was Ralph Waldo Emerson's infamous Divinity School address?
In 1838 Emerson was invited to give the graduation address at Harvard Divinity School. He said that while Jesus was a great man, he was not God. This enraged the Protestant community, who termed him an atheist and corrupter of young minds. He was not asked back to Harvard for 30 years. However, by the late 19th century, the doctrine that Jesus was not God was routinely accepted by Unitarians. Unitarians to this day reject the idea of the Trinity, which entails that Jesus was God. Although they recognize him as an extraordinary human being, perhaps even supernatural.
Why was Pythagoras important?
Pythagoras, c. 570 to 495 BCE, is credited with inventing the word Philosophia. He was born in Samos but settled in Croton, where he founded a brotherhood that was a school, a way of life, and a set of religious and political beliefs. Pythagoras discovered that the musical interval marked by the four fixed strings on 7-string lyres could be explained by ratios of the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. This was an important realization that forms the basis of the concept of harmony in music. Pythagoras went on to explain how number systems correspond to natural phenomena such as the movement of celestial bodies. Pythagoras' insight about mathematics is relevant today, because mathematics is the language of modern physics. Pythagoras and his followers also had a great interest in numerology and theories of the mystical significance of numbers. They embraced music as the spiritual side of number and believed that the right practices in daily habits and diet, as well as playing musical instruments, could enable them to hear the music of the stars and planets. They were strict vegetarians, except for a prohibition against eating fava beans.
Who was Franz Brentano?
Franz Brentano, 1837–1917, taught in Würzburg and at the University of Vienna, influencing Austrian philosopher Alexius Menon, 1853–1920.
Who was Henry Sidgwick?
Henry Sidgwick, 1838–1900, was not so much an intuitionist as the first modern moral theorist who used a combination of common sense and shared intuitions to assess the competing moral theories of his day. As a professor at Cambridge University, he was active in founding Newnham, the first college for women. His wife, Eleanor Mildred Balfour, whose brother, Arthur, was later Prime Minister of England, became principal of Newnham in 1892. The Sidgwicks collaborated on many reform and intellectual projects, including investigations into parapsychology. Sidgwick's principal works are The Methods of Ethics, 1874, and Outlines of the History of Ethics, 1886.
What are some facts about Ludwig Wittgenstein's life?
Quite a lot is known about Wittgenstein's life, although not everything is completely understood. Some stories seem to be in the realm of legends. Wittgenstein was born in 1889 in Vienna, Austria, to a famous and wealthy family of Jewish ancestry. His paternal grandparents were Jews who converted to Protestantism, and his mother was Catholic, although her father was of Jewish descent. Ludwig was the youngest of 8 children, who were all exposed to high culture. Composer Johannes Brahms was a friend of the family. Although Ludwig was baptized as a Catholic, when he confessed his sins to friends later in life, among his admitted transgressions was the fact that he allowed others to assume he was not Jewish. Ludwig had 4 brothers, 3 of whom committed suicide. When his father died in 1913, Ludwig inherited a vast fortune, which he gave away. In 1938, after Germany annexed Austria, he was able to protect his sisters from being sent to concentration camps by giving the German government millions of dollars in gold. Wittgenstein's education included studying mechanical engineering in Berlin. In 1908 he moved to England to study aeronautics, which included experimenting with kites. This led to mathematics and then to philosophy. Insofar as it was a current pursuit to seek the foundations of mathematics in logic. A visit with the mathematician Gottlob Frege, 1848–1925, led Wittgenstein to meet Bertrand Russell. 1872 to 1970, at Cambridge University, where he studied logic with both G. E. Moore. 1873 to 1958, and Russell. But his studies were interrupted by World War I, during which he volunteered for the Austrian army and distinguished himself for bravery. Russell assisted Wittgenstein in publishing Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1922. Wittgenstein then taught elementary school in a rural area of Austria and also designed and built a modernist house in Vienna for his sister Gretel. Returning to Cambridge in 1929, he taught philosophy, becoming a professor at Trinity College 10 years later. He was a hospital porter during World War II and resigned his professorship in 1947. Moving to Ireland to write. Just before dying, he said, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." Ray Monk's biography Wittgenstein, The Duty of Genius, 1991. Is considered definitive as both an intellectual and personal account of Wittgenstein's life.
What is the difference between ethics and morals?
Philosophers tend to use the terms interchangeably. In ordinary usage, however, morals refers to private behavior, whereas ethics refers to public, professional, or civic behavior. Thus, while judgments about a person's morals can be about sexual behavior and drinking habits, judgments about ethics often concern the obligations of people in positions of responsibility, for example, medical ethics.
What is Bertrand Russell's theory of types?
Russell began with a puzzle inspired by the German philosopher Gottlob Frey's 1848 to 1925 attempt to reduce mathematics to logic. Is the class of all classes that are not members of themselves, or C, itself a member of itself? This question seems valid, but Russell showed that it leads to contradictions. If C is a member of itself, then it should not be in D, which is the class of classes that are not members of themselves, but if C is a member of itself, it will be in D. But if C is not a member of itself, then it should be in D, and C is a member of itself. Russell's answer was that there is a hierarchy of types, of things that restricts what can be said about them. So we can say that Russell is an analytic philosopher, but not that a group of people are an analytic philosopher.
Who was Robert Boyle?
Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691, was the 14th child of the first Earl of Cork, who was the richest man in England. As the founder of modern chemistry, Boyle devoted his life to scientific investigation and methodology. He was well received at the British court, and a member of the Council of the Royal Society. Although he declined its presidency and the provostship of Eton because he did not want to take oaths. When he retired to a house in Pall Mall after a stroke at age 42, he maintained his own laboratory. Boyle's goal was to replace Aristotelian mechanics with explanations using just two things: matter and motion. He was also a champion of the new atomism, or corpuscular theory. Boyle's most famous works were New Experiments, physico-mechanical, touching the spring of the air and its effects, The Skeptical Chemist, and The Experimental History of Colors. He also wrote a religious novel, Seraphic Love.
What was Robert Nozick's own political theory?
Nozick, 1938 to 2002, held that any form of distribution is just if those involved are entitled to what they own. Entitlements concern acquisition and transfer of property, as well as the rectification of prior wrongs and errors. He favored a minimal state that served a policing function, and defended strong private property rights for its citizens. Although when analyzing John Locke's, 1632-1704, idea that private property is based on mixing labor with something, he posed this question: why does mixing one's labor with something make one the owner of it? If I own a can of tomato juice and spill it in the sea, do I thereby own the sea, or have I foolishly dissipated my tomato juice? Nozick resolved this puzzle by moving from a metaphysical ground to a utilitarian one, the same way Locke did. We are entitled to what we mix our labor with because the added labor increases the value of the original material.
What is Roman Stoicism?
Roman Stoicism was developed by Seneca the Younger, 1-65 c. E. Epictetus, c. 55-135 CE, and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, 121-80 CE, who wrote Meditations. Many were moved by Marcus Aurelius' advice about restraining anger at his weak subjects. Do not be turned into Caesar, or dyed by the purple, for that happens. Roman Stoicism was influential in the Renaissance and the modern period, and to this day it underlies codes of behavior and moral values in military communities. The basic Stoic premise is that we are obligated to understand the nature of the things we deal with and be prepared to accept, without fuss, unwanted events that are not under our control. Epictetus is famous for saying that if your favorite clay pot breaks, you should remember that it was always fragile and not yours to begin with. And if your spouse or child dies, that is a reminder that they are mortals. Something that we should always remember about the human beings we love.
Has Nicolaus Copernicus' theory withstood the test of time?
The Copernican theory that the Earth and other planets revolve around the Sun is still accepted as true today. Although at first Aristotelians and conservative theologians found the Copernican theory outrageous, the educated papal authorities had a deep interest in science and recognized the explanatory power of the Copernican theory. They tried to get Galileo, who was an enthusiastic supporter of the heliocentric theory, to temper his claims so that the Copernican theory would not contradict religion.
Who was P. F. Strawson?
Sir Peter Frederick, P. F. Strawson, 1919 to 2006, was educated at Oxford University, where he became a professor in 1968. He disagreed with Bertrand Russell's 18721970 theory of definite descriptions because the statement "the King of France is bald" presupposes the truth of there exists a King of France. This created problems because if there is no King of France, then the King of France is bald is neither true nor false, or it is not a statement. Although Strawson was strongly influenced by ordinary language philosophy, he was less interested in linguistic usage than in implied conceptual systems and categories of existence in ordinary reality. In The Bounds of Sense, 1966, he argues for a manifest image, or common, shared, way of understanding the world.
Who was Imre Lakatos?
Imre Lakatos, 1922 to 1974, main contribution to the philosophy of science was to reconcile the work of Karl Popper, 1902 to 1994, and Thomas Kuhn, 1922 to 1996. He was born Imre Avram Lipschitz to a Jewish family in Debrecen, Hungary. His mother and grandmother were killed at the Auschwitz concentration camp. Lakatos, which would be written Lakatos Imre in Hungarian, studied mathematics, physics, and philosophy at the University of Debrecen, changing his name to Imre Molnar to save himself from the Nazis. He was a communist during World War II and took the name Lakatos as a tribute to the Hungarian general and Prime Minister Géza Lakatos. He studied at Moscow State University, but then was imprisoned for revisionism. From 1950 to 1953 for ideas that reinterpreted Marxist doctrine in a way that Marxist authorities considered to be undermining to their official views. He then fled Hungary after the 1956 Soviet invasion. Lakatos earned his doctorate at Cambridge University in 1961 and lectured at the London School of Economics. Lakatos' major works include Proofs and Refutations, 1976, which is based on his doctoral dissertation. The methodology of scientific research programs. Philosophical Papers Volume 1, and Mathematics, Science and Epistemology, Philosophical Papers Volume 2, 1978.
What was the relevance of Plato's laws to Plotinus and Gallienus?
In the Laws, c. 360 BCE. Plato describes a stable system of government that is less utopian than the Republic. c. 380 BCE, because it allows for private families and private property. Some commentators have claimed that Roman Emperor Gallienus was not interested in a Platonic form of government, but that he liked Plotinus and agreed to the plan for a community as a favor to him. Plotinus, it was said, was mainly interested in setting up a retreat for himself and his followers.
What is the philosophy of biology?
Strictly speaking, philosophy of biology is not new because it has been part of philosophy since Aristotle, 384 to 322 b. CE. However, recent thought about how living systems are different from the inert subject matter of physics and chemistry have resulted in new philosophies of biology as a distinct theoretical/philosophical subject. Moreover, social controversies, such as popular debates about creationism and evolution, and beliefs in individual self-determination versus genetic determinism, have injected new vitality into older issues in philosophy of biology.
What topics are addressed in Plato's middle works?
Plato's doctrine of immortality is taken up in the Phaedo, Republic, and Phaedrus. Plato thought that the human soul survives the death of the body. However, the soul's memories of its life are washed clean in the river Lethe. The soul then returns as the soul of another person to live a new life from birth. Also in these works, Plato develops his notion of forms, first introducing them in the Phaedo and going on to define them as eternal, changeless, and immaterial. The relationship between real things to the forms is one of participation. A particular cat that might be your pet, for instance, is a cat because it participates with the form of a cat. While your cat might squint or cough up fur balls, the ideal form cat would not be subject to such irregularities. However, not only neutral and beautiful things have their forms, but everything does. That is, bad cat eyesight and fur balls would also have forms in which they participate. In other words, there is the idea or form of a cat that includes all that makes a cat a cat. And then there is the appearance of your particular pet.
What were Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of liberty?
Berlin developed the distinction in his 1958 inaugural address as Sheikh Heel Professor of Social and Political Theory at Oxford University. Negative liberty is the absence of constraints or interference with individual action. As in a person being free to vote, write a book, or study ballroom dancing. Positive liberty is the human capacity for self-development and determination of one's destiny. For example, some people live in countries without negative liberties, which in turn hampers their positive liberty. Others with positive liberties may not be able to fully exercise them due to economic or social limitations. Berlin argued that, largely due to the Romantic and German idealist tradition, political theorists had been preoccupied with positive liberties as effects of particular forms of government. He believed that the idea of positive liberty was co-opted by both German National Socialism and communism. In the case of communism, the goal of liberty became identical to the goal of state control in the name of collective rationality. For the Nazis, it was the destiny of Germany and its master race that became an overriding value affecting individual lives. Berlin was an advocate of negative liberty in the tradition of John Stuart Mill. 1806 to 1873, which emphasized the importance of minimal government constraint. In other words, he did not think government was a viable source of values or projects for individual life. Plans because when government did assume that function it was likely to become totalitarian and repressive.
What was new in Hume's views on religion?
In his dialogues concerning natural religion, c. 1750s, Hume argued against both a priori and empirical proofs for the existence of God. This was an attack on rational grounds for religious belief. His argument against a priori arguments or the ontological argument used by René Descartes 1596 to 1650, was to claim that nothing that exists can exist necessarily. That is, it is not a logical contradiction to assert the non-existence of anything, including God. His empirical arguments were mainly directed against the cosmological argument and the argument from design. Against the cosmological argument that held the world must have had a maker. Hume claimed that we do not have enough knowledge about the origins of worlds to justify a hypothesis about how this one came about. The argument from design held that just as things such as houses and watches must have builders, the world, insofar as it works well within itself, must have a designer. Hume's response was that we have no grounds to reason from what is true of any one thing within the world to the entire world itself. If Hume's arguments hold, then the only grounds left for religious belief are those of pure faith.
What did Pope Honorius III consider heretical about Johannes Scotus Iri Eugena's treatise?
In De Divus Ioni Naturae Iri Eugena presented a Neoplatonic view of the world and cosmos that was also pantheistic. The Catholic Church did not accept pantheism, which held that God was everywhere in the world, because he was supposed to be separate from his creation. According to Iri Eugena, we cannot ascribe any natural quality from our own experience to God. That view was not a problem for the Pope. The problem was that he described the created world as emanating from God in different stages. God created ideas or Platonic forms, and these created perceptible objects. The perceptible objects could not create anything but instead would ultimately be one with God. Which meant that God was all in all, part of a circle that ended in himself.
What is Daniel C. Dennett's philosophy of biology?
Dennett, 1942, engages evolutionary theory by asking the question, skyhooks or cranes? Skyhooks are unexplained leaps from one stage of development to the next, whereas cranes are ways of understanding a later stage based on the design of an earlier one. Dennett has argued that consciousness, the contents of consciousness, and even the products of consciousness, such as Shakespeare's plays, can be naturalistically understood in the same way that physical evolution is understandable. Neural systems create multiple drafts of the same thing so that the brain itself is a sort of dung heap in which the larvae of other people's ideas renew themselves. Dennett is also a proponent of the doctrine of memes, whereby certain patterns of behavior are products of evolution that are physically inherited. His extreme materialism has attracted many critics, as well as supporters.
What is known about Aristotle's life?
Aristotle of Stagira, 384 to 322 b. CE, also known as the Stagirite, was the son of Nicomachus, who was the Macedonian king Amyntas II's court physician. Aristotle's career was shaped by this relationship with his scientific father. When Aristotle was 17, he enrolled in Plato's academy in Athens. After Plato died in 347 BCE, and the academy's curriculum changed toward the mathematical and speculative interests of its new head. Speusippus, 407 to 339 BCE, Aristotle left for Assos, which was then under the leadership of Hermias, a former slave who rose to the position of ruler that his master had held. Aristotle married Hermias' niece, Pythias, in 345 BCE, and after Hermias died, he traveled to Lesbos. The island of Lesbos, in the northeastern Aegean Sea, had a great diversity of marine creatures and contemporary mammals, as well as many ancient fossils. Aristotle pursued his biological research on the taxonomy of living beings there. In 343 BCE, King Philip of Macedonia invited Aristotle to serve as tutor to his son, Alexander, who was to become Alexander the Great. In 335 BCE, Aristotle returned to Athens. He founded a school, the Lyceum, in a grove dedicated to Apollo Lycurgus outside of the city. At the Lyceum, Aristotle lectured and directed research. He also constructed and stocked the first great library in ancient times. The walkway under a colonnade, or peripatos, was the source of the name Peripatetics that was given to the members of the Lyceum. After the death of his wife, Pythias, Aristotle lived with and had a son with her, Phyllis. Their son was named after Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, after whom he also named his work on ethics. When Alexander, now Alexander the Great, died in 325 BCE, Aristotle retired to Chalcis, where he lived for the remainder of his life.
What reforms did Caesar Beccaria advocate?
Cesare Beccaria, 1738–1794, wrote on Crimes and Punishments, 1764, which was influential against the idea that punishment serves retribution. He reasoned that the purpose of imprisonment was the protection of society and the reform of criminals. Beccaria's book is believed to have been influential in the abolition of torture and maiming as routine criminal punishments by the mid-19th century.
Who is Ruth Barkin Marcus?
Ruth Barkin Marcus, 1921, was educated at Yale, received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1952, and was a founding chair of the philosophy department at the University of Illinois at Chicago. After working as a professor at Northwestern University, she was Halleck Professor of Philosophy at Yale University from 1973 to 1991. She worked in the formal subjects of quantification theory and modal logic, sometimes in disagreement with W. V. O'Quine, 1908 to 2000. One of her most striking achievements was an early formulation of the new causal theory of reference, made famous by Hilary Putnam, 1926, and Saul Kripke, 1940. The causal theory of reference held that words for things have a history from the first time someone used a specific word to stand for a specific object or idea. For example, we call apples apples because that word was the first at some time, in some specific place, to be used to name the fruit. As proponents of the causal theory of reference put it, apples were baptized apples. Marcus' groundbreaking journal articles are collected in Modalities, Philosophical Essays, 1993. She received the American Philosophical Association Quinn Prize for service to the profession in 2007.
What was tragic about Schlick's death?
After the Nazis came to power in Germany and Austria, many members of the Vienna Circle fled to the United States and England. Schlick remained. Although not Jewish, he was distressed by what was then happening in Germany. While walking up some steps at the University of Vienna to teach a class on June 22, 1936, Johann Nelbach, a former student, confronted Schlick with a pistol and shot him. Schlick died of a chest wound. Nelbach was convicted but soon pardoned, after which he became a member of the Nazi Party. Although Schlick was not Jewish, logical positivism was condemned as Jewish thought by the Nazis.
Why aren't there any women philosophers from ancient Greece and Rome who became well known?
The history of Western philosophy has been dominated by men for several reasons. 1. Until the 20th century, few women were systematically educated in ways that enabled the practice of philosophy. 2. Women's family and social roles did not afford them the leisure to practice philosophy. And 3. Male philosophers have traditionally seen the field as restricted to men and have sometimes gone to lengths to exclude women. Nevertheless, in every philosophical period some women have been associated with philosophy as practiced by men, and others have been philosophers in their own right. It cannot be known how much of the work of women philosophers has been ignored, forgotten, or never received the attention it deserved because, until the 20th century, little work by women philosophers was preserved or even mentioned as part of the tradition. The ancient period in Greece and Rome was a foundation for this general, male-dominated trend. Upper-class women were sequestered in special quarters in their homes and not educated for public life. Poor women were heavily burdened by motherhood, domestic drudgery, and agricultural work. Women with some leisure might sew, spin, weave, or listen to men converse, but always in their homes, whereas most philosophical interaction occurred in public places. Overall, women in ancient times rarely had the rights accorded to men. Nevertheless, the names and philosophical work of a small number of women philosophers in antiquity have survived.
Was the Ptolemaic theory merely a matter of religious faith?
No, the idea that Earth was the center of the universe was not based just on religious belief. The Ptolemaic theory, constructed by Ptolemy, 90 to 168 CE, did a fairly good job of describing both sensory experience and astronomical records and calculations that went back several thousand years. The movements of the heavenly bodies, which were themselves believed to be made of different and more ethereal stuff than Earth, could be more or less accurately predicted, according to this theory. It was also in accord with the existing natural philosophy that everything was made up of earth, water, fire, and air, in an ascending hierarchy. However, Ptolemy's assumption that Earth was stationary required a postulation of 80 epicecles to save the appearances, which means that new complicated postulations were necessary to make the theory match observations.
Was Bacon's life as direct and clear as his ideas?
No. Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, lived a complex life with active political involvement in the affairs of his time, great ambition, and the appearance of deviousness. He was born in London and raised as a gentleman. His father, Nicholas, served Queen Elizabeth I as Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. Francis entered Trinity College, Cambridge, at age 12 and soon met the Queen. At the age of 15, he is said to have learned that he was Queen Elizabeth's illegitimate son from her secret marriage to Robert Dudley, at which Nicholas Bacon had been a witness. When his father died suddenly in 1579, it disturbed Francis' prospects for a substantial inheritance. This initiated a lifetime of debt. He began to study law and took a seat in Parliament in 1584 and again in 1586. He urged the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, a Catholic rival to Elizabeth's throne. Then he met Queen Elizabeth's favourite, Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, who was to prove useful as his patron for a while. Bacon applied for a succession of high offices that eluded him, although Essex helped him financially. He did get the post of Queen's Counsel in 1596, but it paid no salary. In 1586 he was briefly arrested for debt. He took an active role in investigating treason charges against his friend and patron, Essex, who was executed in 1601. At the age of 45, he married Alice Barnum, who was the 14-year-old daughter of a well-connected alderman. After James I became king, Bacon was knighted. He served the king well and was rewarded with the office of Solicitor, then Attorney General, and finally Lord Chancellor in 1618. He again fell into debt, however. During this time he was accused and convicted of bribery. His sentence was a fine and disgrace. He continued his studies while in retirement and was honored at age 60 with a banquet held by his Rosicrucian and Masonic friends. The famous poet Ben Jonson attended and said of him, "I love the man and do honor his memory above all others." In 1626 Bacon was in London, travelling through the snow with the king's physician. When he got the idea of using snow to preserve meat, they immediately bought a fowl, had it killed, and Bacon stuffed it with snow. He came down with pneumonia and ate the bird, hoping to regain his strength from it, but died nonetheless.
Who was Themistocles?
According to some accounts, Pythagoras, c. 570 to 495 BCE, the pre-Socratic who founded a brotherhood based on the religious idea that everything is made up of numbers, was taught his ethical beliefs by Themistocles. c. 524 to 459 BCE, the priestess of Delphi. It is known that Apollo was both the god at the temple of Delphi and a deity worshipped by Pythagoreans. Pythagoras and his followers practiced self-examination and dietary and ritualistic purification, including their vegetarianism, based on a belief in the sameness of all life. This principle of sameness might have implied that women should be included in philosophical activities.